The train had been running late since Kansas. Elena knew it before the conductor announced it, knew it the way she'd been knowing bad things for most of her 24 years. Quietly, in the back of her chest, a low and steady pressure that didn't announce itself so much as settle in and wait. She pressed her forehead against the window glass and watched the land flatten out into something enormous and indifferent, brown grass running in every direction under a sky that looked too big to be real. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft along the folds. Dear Miss Hart, I write to you in earnest and with sincere hope that you will consider my proposal. I am a man of modest means, but honest character. My ranch is small, but well kept. I believe two practical people can build something worthwhile together if they are willing to work for it. I would be grateful for the chance to meet you in Red Hollow come October. R. Barnett. She wasn't a fool. She knew what a correspondence marriage was. She knew it wasn't love, not yet, maybe never, but she'd told herself it didn't have to be love to be good. It just had to be solid. She just needed something solid to stand on. The train pulled into Red Hollow at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, 40 minutes behind schedule. Elena stepped down onto the platform with her suitcase in one hand and her small purse in the other, squinting against the pale October light. The town was exactly what she'd expected. One main road, a handful of storefronts, a church at the far end, horses tied to rails. Not beautiful, exactly, but it looked like a place where things could grow. There were maybe a dozen people on or near the platform. She scanned the faces, looking for someone who matched the modest, earnest tone of the letters, someone who looked like he wanted to build something. A man separated from the small cluster near the depot building and walked toward her. Tall, with a broad red face and a coat that fit him well. He had the particular walk of someone accustomed to being noticed. "You'd be Miss Hart," he said. "I would." She offered her hand. "Mr. Barnett." He didn't shake it. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he's considering buying, starting at the top, moving down, taking inventory. Then something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment exactly. Something closer to irritation. "You're thinner than you wrote," he said. She kept her voice even. "I don't believe I mentioned my measurements in my letters." "Your letters implied—" He stopped, glanced at the people nearby. Some of them were watching. He seemed to make a decision. "You're not what I was expecting." "I could say the same." His jaw tightened. "There's no point in dragging this out. I've been thinking on it these last weeks, and I've decided I'm not interested in proceeding. I've already made arrangements with someone else." He said it flatly, like he was canceling a business meeting. "I'm sorry you made the trip for nothing." He turned around and walked away. Just like that. Turned around and walked away, back toward a group of men near the depot who'd been watching, and one of them said something low that Elena couldn't hear, and Barnett laughed, a short, dismissive sound. She stood there on the platform with her suitcase and her purse and her soft-folded letter, and understood very precisely what her situation was. She had $2.37. She had a single change of clothes and a winter coat that wasn't warm enough for this climate. She had spent the last of her savings on the train ticket, having sold nearly everything she owned to fund the trip. The spare dishes, the extra bedding, her mother's small pearl earrings that she'd been putting off selling for 3 years. There was no money to go back east. There was nobody east to go back to. She sat down on the edge of the platform bench because her legs had gone uncertain beneath her, and she looked at the wide, flat nothing of Red Hollow's main road, and she thought, think clearly. Don't cry here. Not here. A shadow fell across the bench. She looked up. The man standing there was maybe 50, weathered in that particular Western way that made age hard to estimate. It could have been 45, could have been 60. He had a badge on his chest and a cup of coffee in his hand, and the expression of someone who hadn't meant to witness what he'd just witnessed, but had anyway. "I'm Sheriff Aldrich Byrne," he said, not unkindly. "Elena Hart." She didn't add anything to it. He sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, just present. "You come far?" "Ohio." He nodded slowly. "Got people here?" "No." He drank his coffee. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her. "I know most folks in this county," he said after a while. "People who might be in need of some kind of arrangement. What can you do?" She thought about the question carefully. It deserved a careful answer. "I can cook. I can mend clothes and leather. I can stretch provisions. I know something about preserving food, jams, pickling, smoking. I can teach arithmetic, reading, penmanship. I'm decent with animals. I learn fast and I don't quit easily. Byrne looked at her sideways. Barnett's a fool, he said. Just like that. Then, there's a man named Cross, Gideon Cross. Has a ranch about 4 miles east, lost his wife 2 winters ago. Got 4 children and a property that's been going sideways since. He's not an easy man, but he's not a bad one. He stood up, tossed the last of his coffee onto the ground. Come on, I'll introduce you. Gideon Cross was standing in his yard repairing a section of fence when the sheriff's wagon pulled up, and he looked at Elena with an expression that she would come to know well over the following months. Not unfriendly, but deeply and fundamentally exhausted. The look of a man who had been solving problems for so long, he'd stopped being surprised when new ones arrived. He was tall, heavier than Barnett, but solid rather than soft, with dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that showed every hour he'd ever worked. The ranch behind him was, she noted it carefully, cataloging, a main house, a barn in moderate disrepair, 2 smaller outbuildings, fenced pasture with a visible gap on the north side, firewood stacked, but not enough of it. Gideon, Byrne said, this here's Elena Hart. She came in on the 2 o'clock and found herself without a situation. Gideon Cross looked at her. Widow? No. Any family in the county? No. He rubbed the back of his neck. I can't afford hired help. I'm not asking for wages, Elena said. She kept her voice steady. She'd made her decision somewhere during the wagon ride out here. Made it simply and without drama, the way she made most decisions. I'll work for 1 meal a day, just give me a roof. Both men were quiet. 1 meal, Gideon repeated. And a roof, that's all. He looked at Byrne. Byrne gave a small shrug that said she seemed straight enough to me. Gideon looked back at Elena, took in the thin coat, the worn suitcase, the particular quality of stillness she had, not defeated, just conserving. I've got 4 children, he said. Oldest is 13. Youngest is 4. The house is not in the best order. I can see that, she said, looking at the yard. Something crossed his face that might have been a rueful, almost smile. You got an opinion on everything? I try to keep them useful. He was quiet for another moment. Then, you can take the back room. Clara, my eldest, she'll show you where things are. He turned back to the fence. Get settled. I expect you down for supper in an hour. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't rejection either. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the house. And as she reached the porch, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before she started thinking about what needed to be done. Clara Cross opened the door before Elena reached it. She was 13 and looked older, not in any worn or unhappy way, but in the way that eldest children in struggling households look older, carrying something invisible but real. She had her father's dark eyes and a set to her jaw that told Elena immediately this was not going to be simple. Papa told me you were coming, Claire said. She looked Elena up and down. You're the one Barnett didn't want. That's one way to put it. He tells everyone they're pretty and sends for them, and then finds something wrong when they get here. He's done it 3 times now. Elena hadn't known that. She filed it away. Well, I'm not here for Mr. Barnett. Then why are you here? Because I needed a roof and your father needed help, and those 2 things happened to line up. Claire considered this with the seriousness of a small judge. The back room is cold, she said finally. The stovepipe's got a gap. Can it be repaired? Papa was going to get to it. I'll look at it tomorrow. Claire's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. A recalibration, small and guarded. She stepped back to let Elena inside. The house was, Elena kept her face entirely neutral, considerably more disordered than the yard had suggested. It wasn't dirty, exactly. It was more that it had been managed by someone, or several someones, doing their absolute best under circumstances that made their best genuinely difficult. Dishes were clean but stacked unevenly. The floor was swept, but the corners had been missed. The fireplace had enough wood but not enough ash cleaning, which would affect the draw. The curtains on the south windows were half down, letting in cold draft around the sill. 3 more children materialized from various corners of the house. Thomas was 11 and regarded her with open suspicion. Nora was 8 and appeared to have been crying recently about something unrelated to Elena's arrival. The youngest, the 4-year-old, was a small, solid boy named Samuel, who walked directly up to her, stared at her suitcase and said, "What's in there?" "My things." "What things?" "Clothes, a book, a sewing kit." He thought about this. "Can I see the book?" "After supper." He considered the terms and apparently found them acceptable because he simply turned around and walked back toward the kitchen. Elena looked at Clara, who was watching this exchange with slightly less hostility than before. "Supper," Clara said. "I was going to do salt pork and cornbread." "What do you have available?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "I know how to cook." "I'm sure you do. I'm asking because I'd like to help, not because I'm planning to take over your kitchen." A pause. "Salt pork, cornbread, some dried beans, half a jar of apple butter." "What spices?" "Salt, some pepper, a little dried sage." Elena set her suitcase by the wall. "Let me wash up, and I'll be there in 5 minutes." She made the salt pork with the dried beans instead of serving them separate, stretching both, giving the whole thing more body, and added the sage while the beans were still soaking it up. The cornbread she made on the thinner side to get more pieces from the same amount of meal, brushed the tops with a scrape of fat from the pork drippings, so they'd have some color and flavor. It wasn't a fine meal, but it was better than what Clara had been planning, and Elena could see the girl knew it even as she didn't say so. Gideon came in from the yard as the food was going to the table. He washed his hands at the basin, sat down, looked at what was in front of him with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. "You cook," he said, not a question. "When I have something to cook with." They ate. The children were quiet in the way children get quiet when there's a new person whose rules they don't yet understand. Thomas kept his eyes on his food. Nora ate carefully, watching Elena from under her hair. Samuel knocked his cup over, scrambled to right it, looked up at Elena with genuine alarm. "It's fine," Elena said. "Cups tip. It happens." He stared at her for a moment, apparently having expected a different response, then turned back to his food. After supper, Elena washed the dishes while Clara dried them. The silence between them wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who understood they were going to have to find a way to exist in the same space and hadn't yet worked out the terms. "How long has your mother been gone?" Elena asked, not looking up from the basin. Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel. 2 years in December." "I'm sorry." "You didn't know her." "No, but you did. That's what matters." Another silence, different in texture than the first. Clara set the dried bowl in the stack and reached for the next one. "She used to make the cornbread thin like that," she said finally. "Said it went further." Elena didn't say anything. She handed her the next dish. Septet. The back room was, as advertised, cold. The gap in the stovepipe was a finger-wide separation where 2 sections had pulled apart, letting heat vent up through the wall instead of into the room. Elena stuffed it temporarily with a wad of cloth from her sewing kit and told herself she'd find something better in the morning. She lay on the narrow bed in her coat, under the 2 thin blankets that had been left there, and thought about her situation with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd applied to everything since the train platform. She had a roof. She had 1 meal a day coming to her. She was in a household with real and addressable problems, which meant she had something to offer, which meant she had a reason to be kept. That was enough. It was more than she'd had at 2:30 this afternoon. She went through what she'd observed in the house and made a list in her head. The firewood supply was at least 2 cords short for a proper winter, maybe 3. The fence gap Gideon had been working on wasn't the only one. She'd spotted another on the east side from the wagon. The root cellar door, visible from the yard, had a broken top hinge, which meant cold air was getting in and threatening whatever they had stored. The children's winter clothes, she'd seen coats on the pegs by the door, were all too small, except Clara's, which had been taken in and let out so many times the fabric was thin at the seams. Things that could be fixed. Problems that had solutions. She closed her eyes. She was up before anyone else. This was not a strategy. She'd simply woken early the way she always did, a habit from years of taking work where she could find it, often before the rest of the household stirred. She dressed quietly and went out to the yard in the gray 4:30 dark to get a proper look at things in the quiet before the day started. The barn held 4 horses, one of them limping slightly. A left foreleg, she noted, would need to watch it. 3 milking cows and a small pen of chickens. The cow's stall needed fresh bedding. The chicken pen's water had iced at the edges overnight, which explained the thin, scratchy ice along the boards. She milked the cows. She wasn't sure if this was her job, but the task needed doing, and she was there and she knew how, so she did it. She broke the ice in the water trough and pumped fresh water in. She found the woodpile and brought in 3 armloads before the sky started lightening. When Gideon came down at 6, he found her at the stove with the fire already going, oats on, coffee hot, and the morning milking done and set aside. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "I was going to do the milking." "I know. I did it while I was out there anyway." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the particular expression of someone who is not trying to be impressive and is not particularly interested in being thanked. "The bay horse in the 3rd stall," she said. "The left foreleg. How long has she been favoring it?" He frowned. "Week and a half, maybe. Why?" "It might be hoof rot starting, or just a stone bruise. Worth checking today." He was quiet. "You know horses?" "Some." He sat down at the table and accepted the coffee she poured. She could feel him thinking something she couldn't read, which didn't bother her. She was used to being underestimated. She was used to the particular patience of waiting for people to recalibrate. The children came down in stages. Samuel came first, appearing at her elbow to ask again about the book. Thomas came second, saw his father at the table, sat down without speaking. Nora arrived, rubbing her eyes. Clara came last, assessed the kitchen, and said nothing. They all ate. Halfway through the meal, Thomas said, not looking up, "Why'd you milk the cows?" "They needed milking," Elena said. "That's Pa's job. Your father was asleep. The cows didn't mind who did it." A pause. Thomas looked at his father, who didn't say anything, who was just eating his oats with the expression of a man who was beginning to adjust to something. "You said you'd show me the book," Samuel said. "After breakfast." "It's almost after breakfast." "Your oats aren't finished." He looked down at his bowl and began eating with a speed and focus that was almost impressive. Clara, across the table, made a sound. Elena couldn't be certain, but she thought it might have been the very beginning of something that would eventually become a laugh. By the end of the first week, Elena had repaired the stovepipe in the back room, let out the seams on Thomas's winter coat and patched the elbows, and identified the 3 worst draft points in the house's exterior walls, which she'd stuffed with spare cloth and noted to address properly with mud plaster when the weather allowed. She'd also started keeping track of the food stores with a kind of systematic attention that the family hadn't been applying. There were more provisions in the root cellar than she'd expected, but they were poorly organized, and some things were being used up faster than they needed to be, while other things sat untouched. She didn't say anything about this. She just quietly began managing it differently. She also began, in the hours between her other tasks, to gather. The woods along the creek bed east of the ranch held more than people realized if you knew what to look for. She found late-season rose hips, thick with vitamin content and good for tea when dried. She found the dried seed heads of certain plants that could be ground for additional meal. She found 2 spots near the creek where the frost hadn't yet reached, where a few hardy root vegetables remained in the ground. Turnips gone wild, thick and reliable. She brought these things back quietly. She didn't announce them. She preserved what could be preserved, boiling the rose hips down to a paste and storing it in the last few empty jars in the cellar. She dried the herbs she found along the south-facing rocks. She rendered the fat from the pork drippings more thoroughly than it had been done before and stored it sealed in a small crock. Nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't say. What they did notice, gradually, the way you notice a room getting warmer, was that meals felt more adequate than they had, that there seemed to be enough, that Nora had stopped having that particular hollow look around the eyes that she'd had when Elena arrived. Gideon noticed. She could see him noticing, but he was not a man who talked easily, and she was not a woman who needed to be talked to, so they existed for those first weeks in a kind of parallel efficiency that wasn't warm but was functional in a way that felt, to Elena, like a kind of respect. Clara, 13 and watchful, noticed most of all. One evening near the end of the second week, she appeared in the kitchen doorway while Elena was working on preserving the last of the wild turnips. "Where do you keep finding things?" she said. "Along the creek, in the south-facing spots. We've lived here my whole life. I never found those things." "You weren't looking for them," Elena said. "I've spent a lot of years looking for things." Clara came into the kitchen and stood near the table watching. After a moment, she said, "Can you show me? Tomorrow morning, if you want." She didn't say yes out loud. She just gave a small nod, the kind that from a 13-year-old girl carrying 2 years of grief and the weight of an eldest child's silent responsibility means more than a whole speech. The horse's foreleg was a stone bruise, not hoof rot, thankfully. Elena knew a poultice, clay, and a little of the sage wrapped and left overnight, that she'd learned from a woman in Ohio who'd had a way with animals. She showed Gideon how to do it. He watched her with that particular attention of his, the look of someone who has decided to pay close attention to something new. "You learned this in Ohio?" he asked. "From a woman named Mrs. Talley who lived on the edge of town. She let me sleep in her barn for 3 weeks one winter in exchange for learning everything she knew." A pause. "How old were you?" 16. He looked at her a moment, then looked back at the horse's leg, adjusted the wrap. "The poultice going to hold?" "Should be fine by the day after tomorrow." He stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers. "You've done this before." "I've done a lot of things before." He nodded, not asking more. She appreciated that. The night the first real cold front came through, 3 weeks after Elena arrived, it dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours, and the wind off the plains hit the house like something personal. Elena lay in her back room listening to it find every gap she hadn't gotten to yet, and thought, "We're not ready, not quite, not yet, but closer than they'd been." In the morning, frost had crept across the inside of the bedroom window, and Samuel had a cough, and the firewood pile looked suddenly less adequate in the bright winter light. Gideon stood in the yard looking at the sky with the expression of a man doing a calculation that kept coming up short. Elena stood beside him, doing the same math. "We're 2, maybe 3 cords short," she said. "I know. There's dead timber in the east stand. Dry enough to use if we got it down in the next 2 weeks. He looked at her. "You notice everything." "I try to notice the things that matter." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow. Can you handle a crosscut saw?" "If you take the other end." Something crossed his face again. The almost not quite smile. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and Elena stood in the cold yard for a moment longer, looking at the sky, feeling the weight of what was coming and the particular grim steadiness that came with knowing you were going to face it anyway. She went inside to start breakfast. The winter was not going to be easy, but she'd stopped expecting things to be easy a long time ago, and she had long since learned that hard and impossible were very different kinds of problems. So 3 nights after the cold front, Nora woke up crying from a nightmare and padded into the kitchen at 2 a.m. to find Elena sitting at the table with a candle and the book she'd shown Samuel. Not reading it, just sitting, because sleep hadn't come easily. Nora stopped in the doorway. "Sorry," she said, in the voice of a child who has been apologizing for her feelings for too long. "Don't be." Elena moved to the stove, checked the coals, added a small piece of wood. "Come sit." She made warm milk. They had it from the cows, a luxury that most nights Elena reminded herself not to take for granted. She sweetened it with a very small spoonful of the apple butter. She set it in front of Nora and sat down across from her. Nora wrapped both hands around the cup. "I dreamed about Mama," she said. "She was here, but she wasn't here. You know the kind where they're right there, but you know they're not." "I know that kind," Elena said. "Do you have them?" "Sometimes." She thought of her own mother, gone when she was 12. "They get less frequent, not less sad exactly, just less frequent." Nora considered this with her 8-year-old gravity. "Is that better?" "I think so, yes. Clara says we're not supposed to talk about Mama too much because it makes Papa sad." "Clara loves your father very much," Elena said carefully. "But being sad sometimes is all right. It doesn't break people. Clara acts like it might." "I know, she's doing her best." Nora drank her milk. The fire settled. The wind pushed at the windows and found them holding. "Are you going to stay?" Nora said. Just like that. The direct honesty of children, the question you can't quite prepare for. Elena thought about the $2 in her purse, thought about Ohio and the pearl earrings and Barnett's laugh on the platform. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm going to do what needs doing for as long as I'm here. Nora seemed to accept this. She finished her milk, climbed down from the chair, and walked back toward the hallway. At the door, she stopped. Thank you for the milk, she said. Any time, Elena said, and meant it. The dead timber in the east stand took 4 days to bring down. Elena hadn't told Gideon she'd never used a crosscut saw for a full day's work before. She'd used one, that was true, a few hours here and there, enough to know the rhythm of it, the way you had to let the blade do the pulling and not fight it with your arms or you'd be useless by noon. But 4 days of it, from first light until the cold made her hands too stiff to grip properly, was a different thing entirely. The first morning she came back into the house at lunch with her palms raw and her shoulders burning and her back in a state she chose not to think about too carefully. She made soup from the bone broth she'd been keeping and ate standing at the stove because sitting down felt dangerous. Like if she sat, she might not get back up. Clara watched her from across the kitchen with that assessing look she had. You're going to have blisters, she said. Already do. Pa's had those hands his whole life. He doesn't notice. I noticed, Elena said. I'll manage. You don't have to do the saw work. I can help him. Elena looked at her. Clara said it with a flat practicality, not an offer of kindness, that just the same ledger brain that Elena herself ran, the one that was always counting what needed doing and who could do it. She recognized it because it was her own. You've been doing too much already, Elena said. Claire's jaw tightened. I can handle it. I know you can. That's not the same thing as saying you should have to. Something moved in the girl's face, a quick flash of something unguarded, and then it was gone again. She turned back to the pot she was stirring without answering. They ate. Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying the particular dry bite that meant serious cold was still building somewhere to the north. The 4 days of timber work added nearly 2 cords to the woodpile, stacked along the east side of the house, where the building itself would break some of the wind. It still wasn't everything Elena had calculated they'd need, but it was closer. Gideon did the splitting himself, working in the mornings before the day's ranch tasks, and Elena found herself watching him sometimes from the kitchen window. Not deliberately, just the way you watch something that has a rhythm to it, the axe rising and falling with the particular efficiency of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it. He was not a man who wasted motion. She appreciated that. What she was less certain about was what he made of her still. He was not unfriendly. He answered her questions directly when she had them, which was most of what she needed from him. But there was a guardedness about him that she didn't push against, because she understood it. He had let a stranger into his household out of necessity and practicality, and she was still, at the end of the day, a stranger. Trust took time. She was not in a hurry. Thomas was the one who made it hardest. He was 11 and had his father's stubbornness without yet having his father's discipline, which was a particular combination. He didn't dislike Elena openly. He was too careful for that, too aware of his father's presence. But he had a way of making her feel the edges of her position there, the not quite belonging of it. He'd ask for things in a way that was just slightly out of reach of rude, the way children learn to when they know the adults around them are paying too much attention to call it directly. One afternoon near the end of November, he came into the kitchen while she was working on the weekly bread and said, Clara always makes it differently. She didn't look up. I know, she makes it with the whole grain meal. I'm using this because it's what's left. She measures it differently. She measures it by habit. I measure it by what we have. That's not how Mama did it. Elena was quiet for a moment. She kept her hands working. The dough needed the time. How did your mother do it? He hadn't expected her to ask. She could tell by the small pause. She did it by feel. She never measured anything. She just knew. That sounds like someone who'd been baking for a long time. She had. Then she earned that. Thomas was quiet. I haven't earned it yet, Elena said. So I measure. When I know this kitchen the way she knew it, maybe I won't need to either. She didn't say, if I'm here that long. She didn't say, that's not guaranteed. She just kept working the dough. And Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment and then went outside. And she couldn't tell if she'd said the right thing or not. She rarely could with him. Nora, by contrast, had begun following her with a quiet steadiness that Elena found both touching and slightly alarming. Not because it was unwelcome, Nora was an easy child to be around, curious and careful and genuinely trying to understand the world, but because she was attaching in a way that felt fast, and Elena was aware of her own uncertain position in the household, and she didn't want Nora to build something on a foundation that hadn't been properly tested yet. One morning, Nora appeared beside her while she was sorting through the root cellar inventory, making her list. "What are you doing?" Nora asked. "Counting what we have." "Why?" "So I know how long it will last." Nora crouched down beside her and looked at the jars and crocks with appropriate seriousness. "Is it enough?" Elena didn't believe in lying to children about practical things. It seemed to her that children who weren't lied to about practical things grew up better equipped than the ones who were. "It's enough for now," she said. "We need to keep adding to it." "What do we need?" "More fat if we can get it. More dried things. Anything we can preserve instead of eating fresh." Nora thought about this. "Could we do the rabbits? Thomas traps sometimes. He mostly just eats them right away, but we could smoke them." Elena looked at her. "Does he trap often?" "When he remembers. Tell him I'll pay him a penny per rabbit if he brings them to me whole and unskinned." "You have pennies?" "A few." She had exactly 11 cents left in her purse, which she was protecting with the same careful attention she applied to everything else. But a rabbit smoked properly was worth a penny as an investment. Nora disappeared. An hour later, Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be indifferent and failing slightly. "Nora says you'll pay for rabbits. A penny each, whole, unskinned, as soon as you get them." "I can't guarantee I'll get any." "I know, that's fine. If you get them, I'll buy them." He thought about this. Why unskinned? Because the skin's worth saving, too. He didn't say anything else. But the next morning, early, before she'd even gotten the fire fully going, there was a knock at the back door, and when she opened it, Thomas was standing there with 2 rabbits. He held them out without speaking. She counted 2 pennies from her purse and put them in his hand. He looked at them for a moment, then looked at her. "I can probably get more," he said. "Good," she said. And that was as close as they got, for a while, to an understanding. The month turned. December came in on a Wednesday, quiet and gray, and the first real snow fell the following Sunday. Not a storm, just a steady, serious snow that fell all day and covered the yard in 8 inches and made the ranch look for about 4 hours genuinely beautiful before the work of dealing with it set in. Elena watched it from the kitchen window while the bread was in. Samuel was sitting at the table behind her, laboriously copying letters onto a piece of paper she'd given him. She'd started spending an hour each afternoon working through the alphabet with him, arithmetic with Nora, and slightly more advanced reading with Thomas when she could get him to sit still for it. It wasn't a school. It wasn't organized enough to call it that. But they were all behind from the 2 years of household disruption, and the winter meant there would be time, and Elena had spent enough years regretting her own gaps in education to feel a certain urgency about theirs. "A," Samuel said, pointing at what he'd drawn. She turned from the window. The letter was a shape that could generously be described as A adjacent. "Almost," she said. "The 2 legs need to meet at the top, like a tent." He frowned at it, tried again. The second one was better. "Good," she said. He beamed at her with a completeness that 4-year-olds were capable of, and nobody else was. The full, uncomplicated beam of someone who has accomplished something and wants the whole world to know. She turned back to the window. The snow was still falling. Across the yard she could see the barn, and through its open door, the shape of Gideon moving inside. He'd been out there since before she'd come down, which meant he'd been out in the cold for going on 4 hours. She made a mental note to have coffee ready when he came in. It was a small thing. She was aware of the accumulation of small things and what they might add up to if she wasn't careful. She wasn't interested in attaching herself where she wasn't wanted, and she was not under any illusions about Gideon Cross's current capacity for anything beyond keeping his ranch running and his children alive. Grief worked like that. It narrowed a person down to the essential, and you couldn't rush the widening back. But she could have coffee ready. That was just sense. He came in at 10:30, stamping snow from his boots. and stopped in the kitchen doorway at the sight of Samuel at the table surrounded by his letter practice. "He's been at it 20 minutes, Elena said, setting the coffee down. Gideon looked at his son with the complicated expression Elena had noticed fathers got when their children did something unexpectedly. Not surprise, exactly, because he knew his son, but a kind of recalibration, like catching a glimpse of who they were becoming. "You're doing letters?" he said. "Eh?" Samuel said and held up his paper. Gideon took the paper, looked at it. "Good one," he said. "Miss Elena says it looks like a tent. She's right." He set the paper back down on the table and picked up the coffee and looked at Elena in a way she'd started learning to read. Not quite a question, but adjacent to one. The look of a man who kept noticing things and hadn't yet decided what to do with the noticing. "I don't mind doing it," she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. "If it's all right with you." "It's all right," he said. He drank his coffee. Outside, the snow kept falling. Shitiem. Clara found her in the root cellar on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December. Elena had been rearranging things, shifting the jars she needed to use first toward the front, checking the turnips for any sign of rot, making her ongoing mental count of what they had against what they'd need if the winter ran long. She'd been doing this systematically since she arrived, and it had become something of an obsession, a habit of mind that she ran through every few days. She heard Clara on the stairs and didn't turn around. "I'm almost done," she said. "I wasn't going to rush you." Clara came down the last step and stood in the cold, looking around at the shelves Elena had reorganized. "You moved things." "I did. Things you need sooner in front, things that'll keep longer in back. Is that all right?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mama kept it differently." "I know. I can put it back if you'd rather." "That's not what I mean." Clara picked up one of the jars, the rosehip paste Elena had made weeks ago, and looked at it. "What is this?" "Rose hips. Found them along the creek. They keep well, and they're good in tea. Useful if anyone gets sick." "You made these?" "Months ago. First few weeks I was here." Clara looked at her. The light in the root cellar was dim, a single lantern on the wall, and it put both their faces in the same pale glow. "You were already storing things then." "I try to think ahead." "How much ahead?" Elena hesitated. This was the part she hadn't yet explained to anyone, the careful, quiet calculation she'd been running since she arrived. She'd been waiting for the right moment, or maybe just for someone to notice enough to ask. "I've been storing since I got here," she said. "Not just using what comes in, actually setting things back. The jar of rendered fat in the back corner, the dried herbs on that shelf, the smoked rabbit Thomas has been bringing me." Clara counted the jars on the back wall. Her expression shifted. "There are more than I thought," she said. "Quite a few more. Pa doesn't know about all of these. He knows about some of them. He hasn't asked about all of it." Clara set the rosehip jar down carefully. "Why didn't you say something?" Elena thought about how to answer that. "Because if I'd come in week 1 and told your father I was rebuilding his food stores because I didn't think he had enough, he might have felt I was criticizing the way he'd been managing. And he's been managing under genuinely hard circumstances. I didn't want to make it harder." Clara stared at her. That's actually how he'd react." "I know." "How do you know? You barely know him." "I've known men like him," Elena said. "Good, proud, exhausted men who are doing everything they know how to do and working themselves raw at it. They don't need someone coming in to tell them it's not enough. They need the problem quietly addressed." The cellar was cold and still. Somewhere above them, Samuel was doing something involving what sounded like a small piece of furniture being relocated, and Nora's voice came through the floor saying, "Samuel, no." Clara looked at the shelves for a long moment. "Is it enough?" she said. "What you've stored. Is it enough to get through?" "Depends on the winter," Elena said honestly. "If it's a normal year, yes. If we get a bad one," she paused, "we're better off than we were. That's what I can say for certain." Clara nodded slowly. She started toward the stairs, then stopped. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, without turning around. "I know You've been protecting your family," Elena said. "That's not the same thing." Clara climbed the stairs without answering. But when she reached the top, she held the door open to give Elena more light to finish by, and she waited there until Elena came up. And that was something. The thing about winter on the frontier was that it didn't announce itself politely. It didn't give you the chance to finish your preparations and check your list. It arrived when it arrived, and you were either ready enough or you weren't. And the gap between those two outcomes was not always as large as people imagined. The second week of December brought a cold that was different from the first one. Not the sharp, dry cold of the early frost, but a heavy, sustained thing, the kind that settled into the ground and the walls and your own bones and suggested it was not planning to leave anytime soon. The temperature dropped past anything Elena could remember from Ohio. The livestock needed water 3 times a day because the troughs were icing over between checks. The horses were pulled into the barn overnight. All 4 of them, which meant the milking cows had to be squeezed into a tighter space and were not happy about it. Gideon was outside from first light to last. Elena made sure there was always something hot on the stove for when he came in because he was burning through reserves she couldn't see. The physical kind. The kind that men like him drew on until they ran out and then kept drawing on anyway because the work didn't care. One evening, she came out to the barn with a plate because he'd missed supper and she suspected he'd missed it on purpose. The particular way exhausted people sometimes forget to feed themselves because the energy required to stop and eat feels like more than they have. He was mending a section of bridle by lantern light, sitting on a crate, and he looked up when she came in. "You didn't have to. I made extra," she said, and set it on the crate beside him. "Eat it or don't. Up to you." She turned to check on the horses. The bay, the one with the stone bruise that had healed well, the poultice having done what she'd hoped, was restless, moving in her stall. Elena put a hand on her neck and talked to her quietly, the low, even murmur she'd learned from Mrs. Talley. Not words so much as sound, a reminder that the world was still stable. Behind her she heard Gideon eat. After a while he said, "Clara told me what you've been doing. The stores." She kept her hand on the horse's neck. "I figured she might." She seemed not upset, more like she couldn't figure out if she should be or not. "I probably should have told you sooner." "Probably." A pause. He was quiet in the way that meant he was thinking, not that he was done. She'd learned the difference. "I should have been thinking ahead that way myself. I knew we were short, but I kept thinking—" He stopped. "You had other things to think about," she said. "That's not an excuse." "It's not an excuse. It's just true." He was quiet again. "Then, what you've put back, do you think it's enough?" She was honest, the same way she'd been honest with Clara. For a normal winter, yes. For a bad one, it'll depend. "And if it's bad?" She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at her with that same particular attention, the full-on directness he had when he'd decided something deserved his complete focus. "Then we'll manage it when we get there," she said. "We're better off than we were. I can keep working. There are still things I can do." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression was working through something she couldn't quite read. Not suspicion, not distrust, something more like the slow recalibration of someone who'd expected one kind of thing and gotten another. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "No one ever seems to know quite what to do with that," she said. Something shifted in his face. The almost not quite smile was closer to an actual smile this time, though it didn't fully arrive. "I expect I'll figure it out," he said. She said goodnight and went back to the house, and she stood at the kitchen window for a moment in the dark before lighting the lamp, listening to the cold settle against the glass. Thomas came to her 3 days before Christmas with 5 rabbits and a look on his face that was trying to be businesslike and was mostly succeeding. "5," he said. She counted out 5 pennies. Then she looked at him. "Have you eaten today?" "It's 2 in the afternoon." "That's not what I asked." He looked away. "Breakfast." She pointed at the chair. "Sit." "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. Sit anyway." He sat with the particular stiff dignity of an 11-year-old boy who is hungry and does not want this to be made into anything. She heated up the last of the noon soup. It was bean and dried herb, nothing fancy, and put it in front of him with a piece of bread and didn't watch him eat, just turned back to her work at the counter to give him the privacy of it. After a while he said, "How come you always notice when people haven't eaten?" "I used to go without a lot," she said. "You get good at noticing it in other people." A pause. "When you were a kid?" "Some, and later too." He was quiet, eating. She worked at the counter. "The rabbits," he said. The smoked ones. Are they for winter? Yes. Is it going to be bad? She turned around and looked at him. He was 11, and he was asking a direct question, and he deserved a direct answer. Might be. I'm trying to make sure we're ready either way. He nodded, finished his soup, pushed back the bowl. I can check the traps every day, he said. Not just when I remember. I'd appreciate that, she said. He got up, still with that careful dignity, and went toward the door. At the last moment, he turned around. The soup was good, he said, stiffly, like it cost him something. Thank you, she said. He went out. She listened to his boots on the porch steps and looked at the 5 rabbits on the table and thought about the accumulation of small things again, the way they built up without you quite noticing until suddenly there was a foundation where there hadn't been one before. Christmas was a quiet thing. There wasn't money for gifts, and Elena had not expected any. Her own situation didn't allow for it, and she wouldn't have asked. But she'd been setting aside small things for weeks. She'd found a piece of ribbon in her sewing kit, red, left from some old project she couldn't remember, and she'd cut it into 4 sections. She'd made each of the children a small thing. For Samuel, a little figure she'd carved from a scrap of soft wood in the evenings, a rough horse shape that was more suggestion than likeness, but had a real mane of twisted yarn. For Nora, she'd embroidered a handkerchief with small flowers and thread she'd unraveled from a sock that was past saving. For Thomas, she'd tanned one of the rabbit pelts properly and cut it into a small square, soft enough to use as a hand warmer or a patch. For Clara, she'd written out, in her clearest handwriting, a collection of 22 recipes. Not elaborate ones, but the practical ones. The ones that stretched and preserved and made much out of little. She'd left them on the table Christmas morning without announcement, tied with the ribbon pieces. Clara picked up her recipe book and stood reading the first page for a long time. She didn't say anything, but later that afternoon, while Elena was working, she came and stood beside her and said, "The rosehip tea recipe. Can I try it tonight?" "Of course," Elena said. Clara made the tea. She made enough for everyone, carried it around herself, distributed it with a quiet ceremony that none of the others entirely understood but accepted, the way families accept the things their members need to do. Gideon watched Clara move around the room with his tea, and when Clara came back to the kitchen, he looked across the house at Elena with an expression that was, for the first time since she'd arrived, entirely unguarded. She looked away first, because some moments weren't hers to hold yet, but she kept the feeling of it, filed it away the way she filed everything she thought she'd need later, and went back to her work. Outside, the snow was falling again. It was going to be a long winter. She'd known that from the beginning. She just hadn't known yet whether long meant impossible or merely very hard. She was starting to think it was the second one. She was starting to think they might actually be all right. She was not a person who let herself believe things too early. But that night, sitting by the kitchen stove with a cup of Clara's rosehip tea while the household slept, she allowed herself something close to it, just for a little while, just for the night. The freeze came on a Thursday. Not a gradual one, not the kind that arrived politely, letting you adjust and prepare and make your peace with it. This one dropped out of a clear sky with no warning, the temperature falling 28 degrees between midday and nightfall, and by the time Elena woke at 4:30 the next morning, the world outside the kitchen window was a different place entirely. The creek had seized up solid overnight. The ground had gone iron hard. The garden plot she'd been picking over since November was buried under a crust of ice that caught the lantern light and threw it back at her like broken glass. She stood at the window for a long moment before she did anything else. Then she went to the root cellar. The door was the one with the broken top hinge, the one she'd been watching since autumn, the one that let cold air seep in around the frame. She'd stuffed it with rags, reinforced it as best she could, asked Gideon twice about getting it properly rehung. He'd meant to do it. He hadn't gotten there yet. She pulled it open and went down the steps and held the lantern up. The temperature in the cellar had dropped significantly. Not catastrophically, the ground insulated it, the way it always did, but enough. The turnips closest to the door had softened at the edges, which meant they'd partially frozen and would need to be used immediately or lost. The jar of apple butter on the top shelf, farthest from the ground, most exposed, had cracked, the lid gone skewed, the contents half crystallized. She made herself stand still and look at everything before she moved anything, accounting first. That was the rule she'd set herself back in October, the rule that kept panic from masquerading as action. Most of the stores were fine. The things she'd put deepest in the cellar, the smoked rabbit, the rendered fat, the dried herbs, the rosehip paste, were fine. The pickled vegetables in the heavy crocks were fine. It was the things near the door and on the high shelves that had taken the damage. She calculated the loss. Maybe 15% of what they had, if she moved quickly and used the damaged goods first. That was manageable. She went back upstairs and built the fire up and put water on to heat, and then went to wake Gideon, because this was not a problem she could solve alone, and she was past the point of trying to manage things silently on his behalf. She knocked on his bedroom door. "Mr. Cross?" A pause. Then the particular quality of silence that meant someone had gone from asleep to awake in one fast movement. "What is it?" "The freeze last night got into the cellar. We need to deal with it this morning before the day warms up and the damage gets worse." Another pause. Then the sound of him getting up. He came out in 3 minutes, fully dressed, which told her he'd slept in his clothes again. Something she'd noticed he did when he was particularly worried about things, as though not undressing was a way of staying ready. He looked at her face and didn't ask how bad it was, just said, "Show me." She showed him. He stood in the root cellar and looked at it the way she'd trained herself to look at it, without immediate reaction, doing the counting first. She watched his jaw work. "The turnips near the door," he said. "We use them today and tomorrow. I can make them into soup and stew and stretch them with the beans. Nothing has to be wasted if we move fast." "The apple butter." "Gone. I'm sorry, I did try to—" "I know you did." He wasn't blaming her. His voice was flat and quiet in the particular way it got when he was managing something difficult. "What else?" "The carrots on the east shelf lost maybe a third. Same story. Use them first. Everything you put deep in the back is fine. The smoked meat, the fats, the preserved things." He nodded. He stood there a moment longer looking at the shelves. "Is it enough to get through?" he said. The same question Clara had asked her. She suspected they'd all been asking it, just not out loud. "Depends," she said. And then, because he deserved the full answer, "The road to town. If it's passable, we should go. Get flour if they have any, salt pork, whatever we can afford. Add to what's here. But if this freeze is going to hold, it'll hold." He said it with the certainty of someone who'd lived through enough winters in this country to read their character. "This one's settling in. We won't see the road clear for weeks." She had known that. She'd been hoping he'd say something different. They looked at each other in the dim root cellar, the lantern between them throwing their shadows up the wall in exaggerated shapes, and Elena felt with a cold and lucid clarity the full weight of what they were in. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went back upstairs to start breakfast. She told no one else how close the margins were. Not immediately. Not in the way of lying, but in the way of choosing the right moment. Because there was work to do first, practical and urgent, and frightening people before the work was done didn't help the work get done. She cooked all the damaged turnips that day, making a thick soup that filled the pot and fed everyone well, which under different circumstances would have been a feast, but which she ate with the steady automatic focus of someone calculating as they chewed. She used the soft carrots in a hash with the last of the pork fat, stretched with grain, and nobody left the table hungry. Thomas, who had developed a sensitivity to the way she moved around the kitchen that she hadn't expected from him, watched her during supper. She could feel it. He didn't say anything until the others had gone to do their evening chores, and then he said quietly, "How bad is it?" She looked at him. 11 years old, with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth. She'd made a habit of being honest with him about practical things, and she wasn't going to break it now. "We had some loss in the cellar last night," she said. "We've managed it. It's all right for now." "For now?" "Yes." He was quiet. "What do we need?" "To be careful with what we have," she said, "and to hope the winter doesn't run longer than usual." He nodded. He got up and took his bowl to the basin without being asked, which he didn't always do, and then he went to check the woodpile, which was his evening job, and she heard him outside moving wood around, consolidating, covering. She pressed her lips together and went back to the dishes. On the third day after the freeze, she gathered the family at the supper table, all of them, including Gideon, who had been outside since early and came in still carrying the cold in his coat, and told them the truth. Not the frightening version, the practical version. The freeze cost us some of what we had stored, she said. We're all right, but we need to be careful. That means smaller portions than we've been having. Not so small that anyone goes hungry, but smaller. It means nothing gets wasted. Every scrap from every plate goes to the next meal. It means we eat things in a certain order, the things that won't keep first. And it means, she looked at Thomas, the trapping is more important than it's ever been. Thomas sat up slightly. I need everyone to tell me if they're sick, she continued. Getting sick wastes energy, and energy right now is the same as food. Sleep when you can. Keep your feet dry. Don't work in wet clothes. She looked at Gideon as she said the last part, because he was the one most likely to ignore it. He looked back at her without comment. Are we going to be okay? Nora asked. 8 years old, and she asked it the way she asked everything, directly, wanting the real answer. Elena had thought carefully about what to say. We have a fighting chance, she said. I'm going to work every day to make sure we come through, but I need everyone's help. Samuel, 4 years old and therefore working with a different understanding of the situation, said, I can help. You can, Elena said. You can make sure you eat everything on your plate and not spill the milk. He considered this with great seriousness. I can do that. Good. Gideon, across the table, was watching her with that full attention look he'd been giving her more frequently lately. She didn't address it. She started clearing the supper things. She had not told them everything. What she'd said at the table was true. What she hadn't said was the part about the reserves she'd been keeping separate from the main cellar stores. Not in secret exactly, but quietly, in a way she hadn't yet had a reason to explain. It had started almost immediately after she'd arrived, the habit too ingrained to suppress. When you'd spent enough years learning what happened when the food ran out, really ran out, the way it had for her twice before, once in Ohio at 16 when the woman she'd been working for had a bad season and cut her wages to nothing, once at 20 when the boarding house she'd been living in had a fire and she'd started over from scratch. You developed a certain relationship with surplus. You put things back not because you expected disaster, but because you'd learned that disaster didn't wait for an invitation. In the weeks since October, she had, methodically and quietly, built a secondary store. Not in the root cellar. That was the family's main supply, visible and accounted for. She'd used a corner of the back room where she slept, the spot between the wall and the floor where the boards pulled up just enough to create a small, cold, dry space underneath. She'd sealed a flat crate down there with everything she'd gathered that she hadn't yet introduced into the main rotation. Smoked rabbit, 6 pieces, well wrapped in the cured skin. Rosehip paste, 4 small jars. Rendered fat in 2 crocks, sealed tight. Dried herbs measured in careful packets. A bag of dried wild seeds she'd ground herself for supplemental grain meal. 2 pounds of dried beans she'd set back from the sack that had seemed ample in October. A small amount of salt she'd apportioned out grain by grain over weeks from the main supply. So small each day it wasn't noticeable. This was her emergency store. The things she hadn't told anyone about because she hadn't known when she would need to tell them, or how, or whether they'd understand it or resent it. She'd been waiting for the moment that made it necessary to explain. The freeze had been that moment. The conversation at the table had not been it. She'd kept the margins honest, but hadn't alarmed anyone more than the situation required. But that night, after the children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger she'd been keeping in the back of a recipe book, and she did the full calculation. The main store, carefully managed, would last approximately 6 weeks at current usage. 6 weeks brought them to early February. A normal winter in this part of the territory broke somewhere between late February and mid-March. The gap was 4 to 6 weeks. She opened the back room, pulled up the boards, and counted what was underneath. The secondary store, added to the main one, extended the calculation to early March, the edge of the gap, the place where it became possible rather than probable. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a while in the cold dark, thinking. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. He was still in the kitchen, which she'd expected. He rarely went to bed before she was back in her room, a habit she'd noticed and chosen not to examine too closely. He was sitting at the table with the account book, which she'd seen him do late at night, running the same numbers over and over in the way people did when they hoped the numbers would eventually change. She sat down across from him without preamble and put her own ledger on the table between them. He looked at it, then at her. "I have to tell you something," she said. She told him everything. The underfloor storage, what was in it, how much and why. She spoke plainly, without apology, because she hadn't done anything wrong, but she was aware, as she spoke, of how it might look. And she watched his face carefully for the particular closed-down look men got when they felt they'd been managed without their knowledge. It didn't come. He listened. He looked at the ledger. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Since the second week, almost immediately." "Why?" She thought about the honest answer. "Because I've been hungry before, really hungry, not just lean times, like the kind where there's genuinely nothing. And I know what that does to people. I couldn't see your children in this situation and not try to prevent it." He was quiet. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I know that." "Maybe." He looked at the ledger again, the numbers she'd laid out. "You're saying we can get to March." "The edge of March. If we're careful." "You were already being careful. You've been being careful since October." "Yes." He sat back. He rubbed both hands over his face, a gesture she'd seen him make only a few times, when something had gotten under the armor enough to require acknowledgement. "Elena." She waited. "This is—" He stopped, started again. "I have been lying awake every night since Thursday doing this math and coming up short. Every night. And you've been sitting on information that would have let me sleep." She had not thought about it that way. "I'm sorry. I was trying not to alarm anyone before." "That's not what I mean." His voice wasn't angry. It was something more complicated than anger. Something worn through to a different texture. "What you've done here. What you've been doing since October. For 4 children that aren't yours and a ranch that isn't yours and a man you barely knew." He looked at her directly. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. The question felt larger than it sounded. "Because it needed doing," she said finally. "And I was here." He looked at her for a long time. She held it without looking away, because she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening. "All right," he said, not closing the conversation, opening something. "Starting tomorrow, you tell me everything you see, not when it becomes an emergency, when you first see it." "Agreed." "And I'll do the same." She nodded. He looked back at the ledger. His finger moved along the row of figures she'd made, not checking them. He could see they were right, just following them, the way you'd follow a trail someone had laid through unfamiliar country. "Early March," he said. "If we're careful." "Then we'll be careful." He closed the ledger and pushed it back toward her. "Get some sleep. You've been up since 4. She picked up the ledger and stood. At the kitchen doorway she stopped, because something was sitting in her chest that hadn't quite resolved. "Mr. Cross." "Gideon," he said, not looking up from the account book. She had been calling him Mr. Cross since she arrived. He'd never corrected it until now. "Gideon," she said. "Thank you for not—" She tried to find the right word. "For not making it into something it wasn't." He did look up then. What would it have been? Some men would have said I was going behind their back, keeping things from the head of the household. He was quiet for a moment. "I've got 4 children that have eaten supper every night for 2 months, he said. "And a cellar that's better stocked than it would have been without you. A man who reads that situation as something to be angry about isn't paying attention." She went to bed. She lay in the cold room listening to the wind and felt something she hadn't felt since Ohio. Since before the pearl earrings, since before the train ticket and the platform and Barnett's laugh. A feeling she couldn't quite name, but that had something to do with being seen accurately. Not perfectly, not romantically, just accurately. She didn't let herself think about it too long. That wasn't how she worked. But she let it sit there for a while, warm and solid, before she went to sleep. Pass it. Clara found out about the underfloor storage the next morning. Not because Elena told her, because Clara, being Clara, had gone into the back room for a spare blanket and noticed the loose boards and was the kind of person who noticed things like loose boards and pressed on them to understand why they were loose. Elena came into the back room and found her 13-year-old standing over the open floor space, looking at the crate below with an expression Elena couldn't immediately classify. "I was going to tell everyone today. Elena said. Clara looked up. Does Papa know? I told him last night. Clara looked back down at the crate. Smoked rabbit, she said, but 6 pieces. She counted the jars. Rosehip paste, fat, beans. She was quiet. You've been building this since you got here. Yes. Clara straightened. The thing in her expression had clarified now. It wasn't anger or suspicion. It was something closer to a feeling that had been waiting for a long time and had finally found the shape of itself. When Mama was sick, Clara said, the last 6 months before she died, she was the one who kept track of things. The food, the stores, the firewood. She kept notebooks. Pa and I, we didn't know how much she was keeping track of until she was gone and the notebook stopped. She stopped. I've been trying to do what she did, but I was doing it from memory, from half understanding things she'd said. I missed things. Clara, I missed the cellar door hinge, she said flatly. I've known it was broken since September. I kept meaning to ask Pa to fix it, and then there was always something else, and I... She stopped again. Something was cracking at the edges of her voice, the thin, controlled quality of it. The apple butter that froze, Mama made that. The last batch she made before she got too sick to cook. I was saving it. Oh. Elena closed her eyes briefly. She thought of the jar, the cracked lid, the crystallized contents. She thought of the things she hadn't known she was managing because nobody had told her their weight. I'm sorry, she said. If I had known, it's not your fault. Clara said it quickly, the way people said things that were true, but that they needed to finish saying before the feeling behind them got too loud. It's not. It's just... She pressed her lips together. Elena crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing, because sometimes nothing was the right thing. Clara stood over the storage crate for a moment longer. Then she sat down on the floor, not on the bed, just on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees up, the posture of someone who is not performing composure anymore. I'm so tired, she said, very quietly, like it was being let out rather than said. I know, Elena said. I've been trying to be... She made a small, helpless gesture, trying to be enough for all of them. Since Mama died. And I know I'm 13 and it's not. Pa does most of it. I know that. But someone has to watch the inside things. Someone has to watch the children and the food and the... Yes, Elena said. Someone does. I'm not good at it like she was. You're 13, Elena said. She'd been doing it for 20 years. I know that. Knowing it and believing it are different things. Clara looked at her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she hadn't cried, which somehow made it more rather than less. You're not going to tell me she'd be proud of me. No, Elena said. I don't know her. It wouldn't be true for me to say it. Everyone says it. I know. Elena looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is what I see. I see a girl who's been holding this household together with both hands since she was 11 years old, and doing it without adequate help or resources, and making 1,000 small correct decisions that nobody has ever thanked her for. I see someone who learned to cook and manage a house and care for 3 younger siblings at an age when she should have only needed to go to school and argue with her father about chores. Clara was quiet. That's not the same as perfect, Elena said. You've missed things. So have I. So has your father. Perfection isn't what we're trying to do here. We're trying to survive, and you've been surviving, Clara. You've been doing it every day. The silence that followed was long and uneven, the kind that has things moving in it below the surface. I don't know how to stop, Clara said finally, carrying it. I don't know how to put it down. You don't put it all down, Elena said. You just share the weight. That's what I'm here for. Not to replace anything, just to help carry it. Clara looked at the floor. A long moment. The apple butter, she said. I had one more batch. Mama's recipe. I was afraid to make it because I didn't want to do it wrong. Do you know the recipe? By heart. Then we'll make it together, Elena said. When the stores allow for the sugar, in the spring maybe. And we'll do it exactly right, and if the first batch isn't perfect, we'll do it again. Clara looked up. You'd do that? Yes. Another silence. Then Clara got up from the floor with a movement that shed something she'd been carrying, not all of it, but some. and straightened her dress and looked at Elena with an expression that was different from any Elena had seen on her face before. Not warm, exactly. Not yet. But open. The door not swung wide, but at least unlatched. "You should know," Clara said, "that I was not easy to you when you arrived." "I know. I wasn't going to apologize, but I wanted to say I know." "That's enough," Elena said. Clara left the room. Elena sat on the edge of the bed for a while and listened to the sounds of the household waking around her. Samuel asking a question in the kitchen, Thomas's boots on the stairs, Nora's quiet voice answering something, and felt the strangeness and the solidness of being inside it. The cold did not break. Through the second half of December and into January it held, a presence as consistent and implacable as a stone wall, and Elena settled into the rhythm of managing it the way she settled into every hard thing, by making it into a series of daily tasks small enough to accomplish. The stores went out in careful daily portions. The woodpile went down in careful daily increments. She kept both counts in the back of the recipe book, checking them each morning, adjusting each evening. Gideon had started telling her things, small operational things, the kind he'd probably been thinking through alone since his wife died. Which fence sections would need work in spring, which livestock was showing signs of age, what the ranch's finances actually looked like. She listened without giving opinions he hadn't asked for. When he did ask, she gave them. She wasn't sure when they'd started doing that. It had happened gradually, the way the temperature dropped. Not all at once, just degree by degree, until one day you noticed the world was a different temperature than it had been. One evening in mid-January, when the wind was doing something terrible outside, and all 4 children were asleep and she and Gideon were the only 2 people in the kitchen, he said, "You mentioned once that you'd been hungry, as a child." She looked up from her mending. "Yes." "Your family?" "My mother died when I was 12. I went to work for various households after that. Some were better than others." He was quiet. "No father?" "He left when I was 4. Brothers? Sisters?" "None that stayed." She said it the way she said most of the hard facts of her own history, neutrally, not as a wound, just as a feature of the landscape. "It was just me for a long time." "Is that why you are the way you are?" She looked at him. "What way is that?" He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated, like someone who's always already thought about what happens if things go wrong. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Probably. It's useful." "It can be exhausting," she said, and was mildly surprised to hear herself say it. It was truer than she usually admitted. He looked at her with something in his expression that she'd started to find harder to categorize than she had at the beginning. "I expect it is," he said. The wind pushed at the house, the fire held. Thomas got sick in late January. Not seriously. A deep chest cold, the kind that announced itself with fever and settled in for 4 or 5 days before letting go. Elena had been watching him for it since she'd noticed him coming in from the traps shivering rather than just cold, the particular quality of a shiver that meant the body was fighting something. She made him stay in. He argued. She was implacable. "The traps can wait," she said. "The rabbits can't." "I'll check the traps." He stared at her. "You don't know where they are." "Then draw me a map." He drew her a map, grudgingly, on the back of a scrap of paper, and she went out the next morning in the cold with the map and the small sled he used for carrying things. And she found every trap on his route, all 7 of them, and came back with 2 rabbits and the information that 2 of the traps needed their triggers reset. When she got back, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket against explicit orders. "I was going to ask if you found them," he said. "I found them." She set the rabbits on the counter and began unwrapping her coat. 2 good ones, 2 traps need attention when you're well." He was quiet for a moment. "You reset the triggers yourself?" "I figured it out. They're particular. The mechanism, I saw that. I worked through it." He looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize as his version of something that would have been admiration from a less guarded person. "Huh," he said. "Go back to bed, Thomas." He went. He didn't argue, which was more telling than anything else. She made broth, real broth, from the bones she'd been saving, the ones that had been cracked and recracked, and would give something still if she simmered them long enough, and brought it to him mid-afternoon. He was asleep. She left it on the crate beside his bed and went back to the kitchen. His fever broke on the third day. By the fourth day, he was well enough to be irritable, which she took as a good sign, and by the fifth, he was back at his traps. He brought her 4 rabbits the morning he went back and handed them over without a word, and she counted 4 pennies from the bottom of her purse. She had 3 left after this, 3 pennies to her name, and put them in his hand, and he looked at them, and then at her, and said, "You don't have to keep paying me." "A deal's a deal," she said. He closed his hand around the pennies. "You went out in that weather," he said, "for the traps. The traps needed checking. You could have just not. No one would have known." She looked at him. "I would have known," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. Then he went back outside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard and thought about the underfloor crate, now 2 rabbits lighter than it had been that morning, and the ledger in the back of the recipe book, and the slow, daily, unglamorous arithmetic of keeping people alive through a winter that wasn't done with them yet. She pressed her hand against the cold glass for a moment and then turned back to the stove. February was still ahead of them, but they were still here, every one of them. And that, she told herself, was everything. February arrived without ceremony. The cold didn't break. It just shifted, the way long winters did, settling from the sharp, aggressive freeze of January into something slower and more permanent, like a weight pressing down rather than a blade cutting in. The sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that way for days at a stretch. The children spent more time inside. The ranch contracted around them, smaller and smaller, until the world felt like it was mostly the kitchen and the barn and the frozen ground between. Elena had 14 days of stores left, by her calculation. 14 days at current usage, which she had already brought to the absolute minimum she could manage without people losing the energy they needed to keep working. She ran the numbers every morning and every night, the way she'd run them through all of January, adjusting for what Thomas brought in from the traps, adjusting for what Gideon brought back from checking the outer pasture, adjusting for the half cup of grain meal she'd started substituting for a full cup in the bread. Nobody had gone hungry, not yet. But the margins were places she tried not to look at directly for too long. Gideon knew. She'd been telling him everything since the night she'd laid out the ledger on the kitchen table, and he'd been doing his own accounting alongside hers, the two of them running parallel calculations that they compared in the evenings after the children were asleep. It had become a habit, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, going over what they had and what they needed and what the next 2 weeks required. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and in Elena's experience, honesty under hard circumstances was worth more than comfort. One evening in the second week of February, he sat down at the table and put both hands flat on it, and looked at her and said, "There's a family 3 miles north, the Aldersons. They've got grown sons, 2 of them. They've been having trouble with the winter too, but they went into it better stocked than we did. They owe me a favor from 2 summers back." She waited. "I'm going to ride up there tomorrow," he said. "See what they can spare, if anything. The road? I know the road. I'll take the bay." She thought about the bay, fully recovered from the stone bruise, steady and reliable. She thought about 3 miles in this weather. She thought about what it cost a man like Gideon Cross to go ask for something. "All right," she said. "You'll manage here." "Yes." He looked at her across the table. "I know you will," he said, and the way he said it was different from the acknowledgement it would have been 3 months ago. Not just noting a fact, but meaning something by it. She didn't examine that too closely. She had work to do. He left at first light. She stood on the porch and watched him go until the cold drove her back inside. And then she went to start breakfast and run through her morning accounting and not think about the 3 miles of frozen road. He was back by midday. He came in stamping snow from his boots, and he set 2 flour sacks on the kitchen table and a small wrapped parcel that turned out to be salt pork. And he stood back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just managed something he wasn't entirely sure he could. "The Aldersons had surplus," he said. She picked up one of the flour sacks. Full. 10 pounds at least. She put it back down carefully, the way you put down something that matters. "What did you trade?" she asked. He was quiet a moment. "Spring labor. 2 weeks of it, me and Thomas." "That's fair." It gets us through. He was looking at the flower with something she recognized. The particular look of a person who has been afraid of a specific outcome for a long time and has just been given a little more distance from it. Not safety, just distance. It gets us through, he said again, quieter. She said nothing. She put the kettle on. Now, the flower changed things in the way that small practical improvements changed hard situations. Not transformatively, not all at once, but enough to shift the air in the house. The bread was fuller. The portions were less apologetic. Samuel stopped asking for more at supper in the particular tentative way he'd been asking since January, the way that had been quietly breaking her heart. But February was not done. On a Thursday, 2 weeks in, Nora woke in the night with a fever that was higher than Thomas's had been, and a cough that had a different quality to it, deeper, more settled. Elena was out of bed and in Nora's room within 30 seconds of hearing her, and she put her hand on the child's forehead and felt the heat of it, and made herself be very still for a moment, thinking clearly. She'd dealt with chest colds. She'd managed fevers before, hers and other people's, had learned from Mrs. Talley, and from a second woman she'd worked for in Ohio, a widow who'd had medical books and let Elena read them. She knew the signs of something that would pass and something that wouldn't. She didn't know yet which this was. She woke Gideon. He came out of his room already awake, the way he'd been sleeping all winter, at the surface of it. He looked at Nora and his face went careful in the way it went when he was frightened and was managing the fright. "How bad?" he said. "High fever. The cough is settled. I need to bring the fever down first and then watch the cough." "What do you need?" "Hot water, the last of the dried yarrow from the herb packets. There's one left, in the blue tin on the shelf. Keep the room warm, but not too warm. There's a difference." He went without asking more. She turned back to Nora. "My head hurts," Nora said. "I know." Elena sat on the edge of the bed and put a cool cloth on her forehead. She'd brought the basin from the kitchen with her, had water and cloth already in hand because she'd thought ahead. She always thought ahead. "I'm going to stay with you." "All night?" "As long as you need." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Are you scared?" she asked. Very directly, the way 8-year-olds ask things. Elena looked at her. "A little," she said, "but being a little scared and doing what needs doing aren't mutually exclusive." "What's mutually exclusive?" "It means they can both be true at the same time." Nora thought about this, her eyes glassy with fever. "Okay," she said, as though finding this acceptable. Gideon came back with the hot water and the yarrow. Elena made the tea. It would help with the fever, not cure anything, just help the body's own effort, and got Nora to take small sips. She spent the night in the chair beside the bed, waking every hour to check the fever, replace the cloth, add wood to the small stove. Gideon stayed too. Not in the room. He sat in the hallway outside the door, back against the wall, long legs in front of him, awake and available. She could see him through the gap when she looked. He didn't sleep. She didn't tell him to. By 4 a.m, the fever had come down. Not gone. Still elevated, still worth watching, but down. Elena let herself breathe properly for the first time since she'd heard the cough. She came out of the room to tell him, and he was still sitting against the wall, and he looked up at her with the question in his face, and she said, "Better." And he put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment in the particular way of a person releasing something they've been holding very tightly. "She's strong," Elena said. "She is," he said. "She gets it from her mother." The hallway was cold and quiet. She went to make tea for both of them, and they drank it at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, and neither of them said much, but the silence between them had a quality now that was different from any silence they'd shared before. Less like two careful strangers managing proximity, more like two people who'd been through something together and were sitting with the aftermath of it. Nora's fever broke fully on the second day. By the 4th, she was up and quarrelsome, which was so much better than the alternative that Elena found herself almost glad to hear her arguing with Samuel about which letters came after Eam. Clara was the one who saw it first. They were in the kitchen together on a Sunday afternoon in late February, the two of them working side by side on the week's bread, a thing that had gradually become routine, Clara taking one end of the task and Elena the other. A domestic division arrived at without discussion. Clara had her mother's recipe book open on the counter and was following a bread variation she hadn't tried before, and Elena was making the standard loaves from muscle memory. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Yes." "When you were talking to Nora that night, when she was sick and scared, she was focused on her dough, not looking at Elena. You told her you were a little scared too." "Yes." "Was that true?" "Yes." Clara was quiet, working the dough. "I never told them when I was scared," she said. "I thought, if they saw me scared, they'd be more scared." "Sometimes that's right," Elena said. "It depends." "On what?" "On what they need from you. Sometimes people need to know they're not alone in feeling something. Sometimes knowing the person taking care of them is also a person, with fears, with limits, actually helps them feel safer rather than less safe." Clara was quiet for a long moment, punching the dough with the practiced efficiency she'd developed. "I was scared about Nora," she said. "Really scared. I didn't say anything." "I know." "How did you—" "You were calm. I was doing what needed doing. Those aren't the same thing." "You said that before, to Nora." "Because it's true." Clara set down the dough and turned to look at her directly, which was something she didn't always do. She usually talked sideways to the work in her hands, the wall beside them. Her dark eyes were serious and tired in the way they'd been since Elena met her, but there was something else in them now, something working toward the surface. "Do you think she's going to be all right?" she said. "Nora, this winter. All of it." "Yes," Elena said. She meant it. "How do you know?" "Because she has people watching out for her. Because this family has been fighting for itself every single day since October and hasn't stopped. That matters." She looked at Clara. "You matter. The way you've held this together, you matter enormously, and I don't think anyone has told you that nearly enough." Clara's face did the thing it did when something got through the careful management, the quick involuntary change, the flash of something undefended. She turned back to the bread. "I've been thinking," she said after a moment, "about what you said, sharing the weight." She was quiet. I want to stop. Trying to carry all of it by myself. I don't even know when I decided I had to." "You didn't decide. It was decided for you." "By Mama dying." "Yes." Clara punched the dose one more time, harder than necessary, which Elena understood. "That's not fair," Clara said. "No," Elena said. "It isn't." They let that sit without trying to improve on it, because some things didn't improve, and the attempt to improve them was worse than leaving them alone. The bread rose in the pan. The fire held. Outside the window, the first honest light of afternoon was making the snow look almost bearable. "She would have liked you," Clara said finally, quietly. Not looking up. "My mother. She would have seen what you are right away." Elena felt that in her chest in a way she hadn't anticipated. She kept her hands on her own dough. "That's kind of you to say." "I'm not being kind," Clara said. "I'm just saying what's true. The day the road opened, Elena thought it was a dream. She was carrying water from the pump when she heard a sound she hadn't heard since November. Horses on the road, more than one, moving at a pace that meant the ground under them was solid and passable. She stood in the yard with the bucket in her hand and listened, and then she heard wheels, and she set the bucket down. A wagon came into view at the bend. One of the Alderson sons, she thought, with a load of supplies he was carrying to somewhere further out. He slowed when he saw her, touched his hat. "Morning," he called. "Road's clear past the creek. Looks like it's going to hold." She looked at the sky, pale blue and thin but genuine. Actual sunlight doing actual work on the snow at the edges of the yard. She looked at the road. "Thank you," she said. He drove on. She picked up the bucket and went inside. Gideon was at the table with his account book. He'd been going through it all week with the particular focused attention of someone who'd been waiting for the ability to act and could now see the moment coming. He looked up when she came in. "Road's open," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a long breath through his nose and sat back, and she saw the months of it come off his shoulders in one movement. Not all of it. It never comes off all at once, but enough. "We made it," he said. "We did." He looked at her. "We did," he said again, and this time it wasn't just a fact. It was the two of them, and the children in the next room, and the stores they'd managed down to the last careful portion, and the ledger with its numbers that had added up to enough, barely precisely by the width of a hair, but enough. She smiled at him. Not a performed smile. A real one. The kind that happened to her face without her deciding on it. It must have surprised him, because he looked at it for a moment like something unfamiliar. Then he smiled back. Small, imperfect, tired around the edges. Real. Sheriff Byrne came out 3 days later, the first day anyone had been able to make the 4-mile trip from town, riding a roan horse that was as glad to be moving as he was. He tied up at the fence and came in for coffee, and sat at the kitchen table looking around at the household with the slow, comprehensive attention of a man who'd been wondering about a situation for months. "Everybody well?" he asked. "One chest cold each," Elena said. "Everyone's through it." He nodded. He looked at Gideon. "Ranch?" "Standing," Gideon said. Byrne drank his coffee. He looked at Elena. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Something came through town last week. An offer." She waited. The general store, Harmon's, the owner's wife has been managing the accounts and the correspondence business for years, but she's been talking about going to live with her daughter in Laramie. Harmon's looking for someone to take it on. Paid position. He paused. "He asked me if I knew of anyone with the right skills. He's offering room and board in the back of the store plus wages." The kitchen was very quiet. "He heard about you," Byrne said, not unkindly. "Word gets around in a town this size. He heard you could do accounts and correspondence, and that you were practical. He asked me to bring you the offer." Elena was aware of Gideon on the other side of the table, not moving. She was aware of Clara in the doorway, where she'd come to stand at the sound of an adult conversation that involved her household, the habit of a girl who'd needed to be alert to such things for a long time. She was aware of the kitchen around her, the bread on the counter she'd made this morning, the herbs drying on the south window, the chair where Samuel sat every afternoon to practice his letters. "What are the wages?" she said. Byrne told her. They were better than she'd expected, not extravagant. Nothing in Red Hollow was extravagant, but real. The kind of wages that would let a woman build something for herself. The kind of independence she'd come west hoping for, in a different shape than she'd imagined it. She looked at the table in front of her. "Can I give him an answer in a week?" she said. "He said he'd wait," Byrne said. He finished his coffee and rode back to town, and the sound of his horse faded out on the road, and the kitchen settled back into its particular silence. Gideon got up from the table and went to the barn without saying anything, which was how he handled things that required thinking rather than talking. Clara disappeared from the doorway. Elena sat at the table alone for a while, and she ran the calculation, not with the ledger this time, just in her head. Different kind of math, the kind that doesn't have clean numbers. What she'd have. Wages. A room of her own. Independence she'd wanted her whole life. A role that used what she was good at. No more asking permission for anything. No more uncertain position. No more depending on someone else's need of her for her survival. What she'd leave. A kitchen that had learned her hands. A root cellar she'd built from almost nothing. 4 children who had stopped looking at her like she didn't belong there, most of the time. A man who'd started talking to her in the evenings like she was a person worth talking to. She was still sitting there when Thomas came in from checking the traps. He stopped when he saw her face. He read it, the way he'd gotten good at reading things. He set the trap bag down without making noise about it. "Byrne brought an offer," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "In town?" "Yes." He stood there with his coat still on. He was 11, and he was one of the least sentimental people she'd ever met, and the thing on his face right now was something he was visibly not going to describe as what it was. "Are you going to take it?" he said. "I'm thinking about it," she said honestly. He nodded. He picked up his bag and went to hang his coat. At the door he turned around. "You could do both, maybe," he said. "Go to town some days, come back." "It doesn't work that way. Town job needs someone there." He absorbed this. "Well," he said. He sounded remarkably like his father. "You should do what's best." He went upstairs. She heard his boots on the steps, each one distinct, counting out. Gideon came back in at dusk. She was starting supper. She heard his boots on the porch, heard him hang his coat, heard him come to the kitchen doorway. She kept her hands on the pot. The Aldersons need to be paid back, he said. 2 weeks of spring labor. I know. The south fence needs redoing. The barn roof needs work before next winter. I've got 3 calves coming in April, and I'll need help managing them. I know, she said again. I don't say any of that to... He stopped. I'm not trying to make the decision for you. I know that too. He was quiet. She heard him move, not leaving, just shifting, the sound of someone who needs to say something and is working out the shape of it. What Byrne said about Harmon's, he said finally. The wages. Yes? They're fair. It's a good offer. It is. You'd have your own room, your own income. Nothing depending on someone else's situation. She turned around to look at him. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his face doing the same thing it did when he was running numbers. Not closed, just careful, deliberate. You'd be telling me to take it, she said. I'm telling you what it is. A pause. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You're a grown woman who's been making hard decisions on your own since you were 16 years old. She looked at him. But He stopped again, cleared his throat. I'd rather you stayed, he said. The plainness of it was characteristic, the directness without ornament. Not as hired help, not as someone who asked for a roof once and got stuck, as someone who belongs here, if that's something you want. The kitchen was very quiet. You're not asking me to stay out of practicality, she said carefully. You have enough reasons for practicality. This is something else. Yes, he said. Gideon. Yes. You should probably think about that before you say it. I've been thinking about it since January, he said. Since before that, if I'm being honest. I'm not a man who says things I haven't thought about. She looked at him for a long time. This man with his worn account books and his 4 children and his ranch that wasn't thriving but was standing stubbornly through everything. This man who had let her in when he didn't have to and had never once tried to manage her, had never once treated her position as something she should feel grateful enough for that she forgot herself. She turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and the stove was something to do with her hands. I want to go to town, she said. I want to answer Harmon myself. I want to hear the terms directly. Of course, he said. And after that, she kept her voice steady. We'll talk. He nodded. She heard him move away from the doorway, heard him settle at the table, not leaving, just waiting, the way he'd learned to wait, patient and present. She made supper. She called the children. They came down in the usual order. Samuel first, then Nora, then Thomas, then Clara. They sat in the usual places. She put food on the table and sat in her usual chair across from Gideon, and they ate. Samuel knocked his cup over. I've got it, Thomas said, and mopped it up before anyone else moved, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had decided cleaning up small messes was an acceptable way to be useful. Nora said something that made Clara laugh. A real laugh, not cautious or brief, the kind Nora had been managing to get out of her with increasing regularity since February. Gideon passed the bread. Elena looked at the table, at the people around it, at the food she'd made from what they had, which was not much but was enough, which was what she'd been doing since October, making enough out of what they had. She had spent most of her life being the woman who got the smallest portion. At other people's tables, in other people's kitchens, eating last, eating least, grateful for whatever was left. She looked at the table in front of her. She would go to town. She would hear what Harmon had to say. She would make the decision with her whole self, eyes open, the way she'd been trying to make decisions since she was 12 years old, and realized no one was going to make them for her. But tonight she was here. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she was sitting at a table and nobody was eating the smallest portion, and the food was enough, and the fire was holding, and the winter was almost over. She picked up her fork. She ate. She went to town on a Wednesday. Gideon offered to drive her. She told him she'd rather go alone, and he accepted this without argument, which was one of the things she'd come to understand about him. He had opinions, often strong ones, but he'd learned somewhere in his life that other people's decisions belonged to other people, and he didn't dress up interference as concern. He hitched the smaller wagon for her, checked the horse's girth, and stood back. Take your time, he said. She drove the 4 miles into Red Hollow, with her hand steady on the reins and the March air cold and thin around her, the sky doing something it hadn't done in months, actually trying. Pale blue working through the cloud cover, light that had some intention behind it. The snow at the road's edges had gone gray and granular, the particular texture of snow that was losing its argument with the season. She had not been back to Red Hollow since the day she arrived. The town looked smaller than she remembered, which she knew was just the effect of months of open ranch land recalibrating her sense of scale. The main road, the handful of storefronts, the church at the far end. The depot building where she'd sat on the platform bench and understood that she had nothing. She tied the horse at the rail outside Harmon's general store and went in. Gerald Harmon was a compact, practical man in his 60s with the particular manner of someone who had been running a business in a small town long enough to have lost any interest in performance. He showed her the accounts ledgers, real ones, not a summary, and walked her through what the position required. She asked specific questions. He answered them. She asked about the room in the back. He showed her. It was small, clean, a window that faced the alley rather than the street, which meant quiet mornings. A stove that looked adequate. A door with a bolt on the inside which mattered more than most people would think to consider. The previous woman had it for 11 years, Harmon said. She kept the books to the penny. I'm not looking for someone to improve on her. I'm looking for someone who won't let it fall apart. I can do that, Elena said. Byrne says you can do considerably more than that. Byrne is generous. Harmon looked at her with the flat assessment of a man who'd hired enough people to recognize when he was looking at someone reliable. The wages are as I said, room and board on top. You'd start in 2 weeks if you want it. She looked around the small room, at the window with its alley view, at the bolt on the door, at the life she could build here, quiet, self-sufficient, belonging to no one but herself. She had wanted this. She had wanted exactly this. Can I give you an answer by Friday? She said. Friday's fine, he said. She walked back out through the store, past the shelves of dry goods and seed packets and the things that the people of Red Hollow needed to keep their lives running, and she pushed open the front door and stepped out onto the main road. And stopped. R. Barnett was coming out of the barber shop across the street. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. She watched the recognition move across his face. And then something else, a recalibration that happened fast but not fast enough to hide. He'd heard things. She could see that he'd heard things. 5 months in a small town meant 5 months of being a particular kind of story. The woman Barnett rejected. The woman who ended up at the Cross Ranch. The woman who'd kept that family alive through the worst winter in recent memory. She knew how stories moved in places like this. She'd been aware of it abstractly, but standing here on the main road watching his face, she felt the reality of it with a sharpness that surprised her. He crossed the street. She did not move. Miss Hart, he said. He'd arranged his face into something pleasant, something that might pass for warmth at sufficient distance. I'd heard you were still in the county. I am, she said. Doing well, it sounds like. He paused. The pleasantness on his face was working harder than it should have needed to. I've been meaning to say, the way things went at the depot. I may have been too hasty. She looked at him. He was the same as he'd been on the platform in October. Red-faced, well-coated, the walk of a man accustomed to being noticed. She waited to feel something complicated. She didn't. She felt remarkably clear. You weren't hasty, she said. You made a decision. It was the right one for you. He blinked. I've been reconsidering, Mr. Barnett. She kept her voice even. I'm not reconsidering anything. I'm on my way back to the Cross Ranch. She paused, because she believed in being accurate. Or I will be, once I've finished my business here. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who expected that the woman he'd rejected in public would be grateful he was now reconsidering. The expression of someone who had not updated his understanding of the situation even slightly. Cross is a struggling rancher, he said. Whatever arrangement you have out there is mine, she said. Good day, Mr. Barnett. She untied the horse, climbed up onto the wagon seat, and drove. She didn't look back to check his expression. She was done looking back. She told Gideon that night. Not about Barnett, that felt irrelevant, a detail without consequence, but about the position. The room, the wages, the 2 weeks. They were at the kitchen table again, the lamp between them. The house quiet above them. The children settled for the night, only the sound of the fire and the last of the winter wind doing diminishing work against the walls. Harmon's a fair man, Gideon said. He is. The position is what Burns said it was. She kept her hands flat on the table. The wages would give me something I've never had. Real security. Something I built myself. I know, he said. I'm not saying that to... She stopped. Tried again. I want you to understand what it means. That I'm not deciding this casually. I've been waiting my whole life for something like that offer. I know, he said again, and the thing about Gideon Cross was that when he said he knew, he actually meant it. He wasn't performing understanding. He'd listened over these months with the same complete attention he gave everything that mattered to him, and she knew he understood what she was saying because she'd watched him hear her all these weeks. What you said, she said, last week, that you'd rather I stayed. He held her gaze. I meant it. As more than, you said, not as hired help. I said as someone who belongs here. And now I'm asking you to be clearer than that, she said, because I need to make a real decision and I need real information, and I am not a woman who acts on implications. A pause. Something moved through his expression, not discomfort, more like the look of a man who knows he has to say a plain thing plainly and is gathering himself for it. I'm asking you to stay as my wife, he said. If that's something you'd want. If it's something you could want. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, and I'm not asking you to pretend the Harmon offer doesn't exist. He stopped. I'm asking you to consider it alongside the other thing. Not instead of it. Alongside. She was quiet for a moment. You have 4 children, she said. I'm aware. They've had enough people leave. Yes. And you? She looked at him. You've had enough loss. I have? He said it without flinching, which she respected. I'm not a man who does things without thinking about them first. I've thought about this. All winter, if I'm honest. Before January, even. You asked me to be clearer, so I'm being clear. I think you are the most capable, most practical, most genuinely decent person I've encountered in a very long time, and I would like very much for you to stay. Not because we need you, although we do. Because I would like you to stay. The kitchen was warm. The fire held. She thought about the room above Harmon's store, the bolt on the door, the ledgers kept to the penny. She thought about Thomas's face when she'd come back from his trapline with 2 rabbits. She thought about Nora drinking warm milk at 2 in the morning. She thought about Clara making rosehip tea and carrying it around the room with a quiet ceremony only she understood. She thought about Samuel drawing A's that looked like tents and beaming about it with his whole face. She thought about sitting at this table month after month, doing the math, and the particular feeling of doing the math with someone beside her who was doing it too. I want to say something, she said. All right, I came here with nothing, $2 and a letter and a suitcase with a broken clasp, and I made a deal for 1 meal a day because that's all I thought I could ask for. She kept her voice even, but it cost something. I've spent a long time asking for the smallest portion, not just of food, of everything. Space, consideration, belonging. I got very good at making the smallest portion feel like enough. He didn't say anything. He was listening. If I stay, she said, I'm not staying as the woman who was grateful for 1 meal a day. I'm not staying as a convenience or a solution to a problem. I'm not staying as something between hired help and family that doesn't have a clear name. She looked at him directly. If I stay as a full person. In this house, in this family, in whatever you're asking. Fully, not the smallest portion of it. Gideon Cross looked at her across the kitchen table, and his face was doing what it did when he was feeling something he hadn't built a structure for yet. That's what I'm asking, he said. Exactly that. She nodded, slowly. Then I need to sleep on it, she said, and you should too. I've been sleeping on it since November, he said. 1 more night won't hurt you. Something crossed his face, the smile that never fully arrived. She got up and put her cup in the basin and went to bed, and she lay in the back room that wasn't cold anymore. She'd fixed the stovepipe months ago. It had been holding fine all winter, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about the rest of her life. She went to sleep before she'd finished thinking about it. That, more than anything, told her what she already knew. Tut. She told Harmon on Friday. She drove into town again alone, tied the horse at the same rail, walked into the store. He was behind the counter, going through invoices. He looked up. "I'm grateful for the offer," she said. "It's a fair one. I'm going to decline." He looked at her for a moment. Not surprised. He had the face of a man who'd learned to read situations. "Cross Ranch?" he said. "Yes." He nodded. "He's a good man," he said. "Had a rough few years. You did good work out there this winter, from what I hear." "We all did," she said. He put his hand out. She shook it. She walked back out into the March morning, which had gone genuinely warm for the first time since autumn. Not summer warm, nothing dramatic. Just the particular thin warmth of a season that was finally meaning what it said. She drove back to the ranch. She was halfway there when she saw them on the road. Gideon had the wagon. All 4 children were in the back, Thomas sitting upright, Nora with her legs dangling off the side, Clara sitting properly, Samuel standing and holding the side rail until Thomas pulled him down by the back of his coat. They were coming to town, which they'd been talking about doing once the road held. Supplies, seed for spring, things that had been on the list since January. She pulled her wagon alongside his on the wide section of road. Both horses blew and settled. "Well," Gideon said. "I told him no," she said. Something moved through his face, not triumphant, nothing like that. More like a held breath releasing. "All right," he said. From the back of the wagon, Nora said, "Are you coming with us to town?" Elena looked at the wagon, at the 4 of them, at Gideon. "I'll turn around," she said. She turned the wagon around on the road and fell in beside them, and they went to town together. Both wagons on the road, the horses matching pace with each other in the easy way horses did when they were used to the same barn. They had barely reached the edge of town when Thomas said, very quietly, from the wagon behind, "He's here." Elena looked up. Barnett was standing outside the hardware store. He saw them, saw her first, then Gideon beside her, then the children in the back. And she watched the whole of it move through his face, the recognition of what he was looking at, the understanding of what he'd walked away from on that platform, laughing, in front of half the town. Not a thin, exhausted woman with a broken clasped suitcase. The woman who had kept a family alive through the worst winter anyone could remember. The woman sitting on a wagon seat next to Gideon Cross, in the particular way 2 people sat when they decided something together. He took a step toward them. Gideon looked at Elena. "You all right?" he said. "Completely," she said. Barnett opened his mouth. She didn't give him the space of it. "Mr. Barnett," she said pleasantly from the wagon seat. "Good morning." He closed his mouth, opened it again. "Miss Hart, I was hoping we'd have a chance to—" "We're running errands," she said. "Family day. You'll excuse us." She didn't wait for his response. She looked back at the road ahead, and Gideon clicked his tongue at the horse, and they moved on, and she heard Barnett say nothing behind them because there was nothing to say, no sentence that could rearrange what he was looking at into something that served him. From the back of the wagon, Samuel said loudly, to no one in particular, "Who was that man?" "Nobody," Thomas said. She heard Clara make a sound. The full laugh this time, unguarded, real. She heard Nora start laughing too. She felt it in her own chest, something light and clean, something that surprised her a little by arriving, the way good things sometimes do. She did not turn around to look at Barnett. She was done turning around. Chatit. Gideon asked her properly on a Sunday evening in late March, when the last of the snow had pulled back to the shaded north sides of things, and the south-facing pasture had gone from white to brown to the first uncertain green. He didn't make a ceremony of it. She hadn't expected him to and wouldn't have wanted him to. He came into the kitchen after the children were in bed, and he stood in the doorway for a moment in the way he had, and she looked up from the herb drying she was doing. New season, new plants along the creek bed. She'd already started building the stores back before the old ones were fully depleted, the habit unshakable, and she could see it on his face before he said anything. "I want to do this right," he said. "You don't have to—" "I want to," he said, and then simply, "Elena Hart, will you marry me?" Not performed as a question, said the way he said everything that mattered, plainly with the full weight of meaning it. She set down the dried sage she'd been bundling. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Crossed the kitchen. She stood up, and he took her hands in his, both of them. Her hands that had raw spots from the crosscut saw and work-roughened knuckles from 4 months of frontier winter. His hands that were larger and calloused in different places, but recognized hers in the same register. Practical hands, working hands, the hands of people who dealt with things directly. He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to. They stood in the kitchen in the lamplight for a moment, just that. Two imperfect people who had looked at each other clearly, in hard circumstances, and decided yes anyway. There was nothing smooth about it, nothing that felt like a story reaching its appointed conclusion. It felt like a choice, real and full of consequence, made by two people who knew what choices cost. She thought about what she'd said at this same table, months ago, in the dark, when she'd first laid out the ledger between them. We're better off than we were. It had been about the food stores. It had been about surviving the winter. But she thought about it now and found it still true, and truer in more ways than she'd meant. He squeezed her hands once, let go, sat back down at the table. She sat across from him. "The children," she said. "Clara knows," he said. "She figured it out in February. She didn't say anything to the others. Of course she figured it out. She has a few opinions. I'd be worried if she didn't." He almost smiled. "She said, and I'm quoting her directly here, that it was about time someone in this house made a sensible decision." Elena looked at him. "She said that." "She did. That is possibly the nicest thing she's ever said to me, framed as an insult." "That's Clara," he said. They sat together for a while in the comfortable quiet that had taken them months to build, and that she understood now was not a small thing. Quiet took time to become comfortable. It required knowing someone well enough to not need to fill the space between you. She had not had that with many people in her life. She had not expected to find it here. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "When I first got here, first week, what did you actually think?" He was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, the one she'd learned to wait out. "I thought you were going to leave," he said. "In the first few days when you saw the state of things, I thought you'd find a way out." "I didn't have anywhere to go." "I know. But people find ways out anyway when things are harder than they expected. I've seen it." He looked at his hands on the table. "And then you didn't. And then you just kept doing the next thing. Every day. Just the next thing. And at some point I stopped expecting you to leave and started..." He paused. "Started worrying about a different thing instead." She understood what the different thing was. She didn't make him say it more plainly than he already had. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." "Desi," they told the children at breakfast. Or rather, Clara told them, because Clara had apparently been sitting on this information for 6 weeks, with the particular controlled patience of a 13-year-old who has decided that some things are hers to know first. And she presented it at the table between the oats and the bread with the air of someone announcing a development she had personally authorized. "Papa and Elena are getting married," she said, "so Elena is staying." Nora looked at Elena, then at her father, then back at Elena. "I already knew you were staying," she said. "How?" Elena asked. "Because you already know where everything is," Nora said, as though this was the only metric that mattered. Thomas said nothing for a moment. He was looking at his bowl. Then he looked up at Elena and gave her a single nod, the kind that in 11-year-old boy language contained an entire speech, the whole of which was that he'd known this was happening and had already decided it was acceptable, and she didn't need to make a thing of it. She nodded back. The same kind of nod. He went back to his oats. Samuel, 4 years old and magnificently literal, looked at Elena and said, "Will you still show me letters?" "Every afternoon," she said. "Okay," he said. He picked up his spoon. "Can I have more oats?" "You can," she said. She gave him more oats. They were married on the first Saturday in May, in the small ceremony that frontier practicality made sensible. Sheriff Byrne, who turned out to also be a justice of the peace, stood in the Cross family's yard and made it legal while the children stood around in their best clothes with varying degrees of ceremony. Samuel's shirt was already untucked by the time it started. Thomas stood with his arms crossed and his chin up like he was guarding something, which she found, privately, very moving. Clara stood beside Elena without being asked to and held the small bunch of early-season wildflowers that Nora had collected from the creek bed with devoted and somewhat indiscriminate enthusiasm. Elena wore the best dress she had, which was not spectacular but was clean and pressed and hers, and she stood in the yard in the May sunshine and looked at Gideon Cross and said the words in a clear voice, and he said them back in the same plain way he said everything that mattered, and Burns signed the paper, and that was that. There was no moment when she felt transformed. Nothing closed or opened dramatically. She just stood in the yard of a ranch that she'd spent a winter keeping alive, next to the man she'd learned to trust in the way you learn to trust something tested, rather than something merely promised, and felt the solid fact of it, the realness of a choice made fully by a person who knew what it meant. She thought about the train platform in October, the $2 in her purse, the letter with its soft folds. She thought about the way she'd sat on that bench and made herself think clearly instead of crying, and made one decision, and then the next, and then the next, each one small enough to actually make. She thought about all the women she'd known who'd been told their value was in their appearance, their compliance, their ability to make themselves smaller and quieter and less. Women who'd been looked at on platforms and found wanting. She'd been one of them. She knew what it felt like to be measured by someone else's inadequate tools. What she knew now, had learned not from a single moment but from a winter of specific daily evidence, was that the tools people used to measure you said more about them than about you. Barnett's measure had been immediate and shallow, and it had told her nothing useful. The Cross family's measure had taken months and been fair and had found her, not perfect, not flawless, not easy, but worth keeping. That was, she thought, all any person could reasonably hope for. To be seen clearly, by people who were paying attention, and found worth keeping. The afternoon after the ceremony, while Gideon was in the barn and the children were dispersed about the yard in various states of restlessness, Elena went to the kitchen and started supper. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who knew it entirely, where the light fell in the afternoon, which floorboard talked back, how the stove drafted and at what point it ran too hot. She knew this kitchen the way her mother's recipe book said you should know your bread dough, by feel, by instinct, by accumulated time. Clara came in after a while and stood at the counter and began, without being asked, to do the thing she always did, take the other end of whatever task was happening. They worked side by side in the easy, particular silence they'd built over winter, two people who had learned each other's rhythms and could share a kitchen without negotiating it. "I've been thinking," Clara said. "About what?" "The apple butter. We have enough sugar now, enough apples in the cellar." She kept her eyes on the carrots she was cutting. "We could do it this week." Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought of what Clara had told her in the back room, the last batch her mother had made, the recipe Clara knew by heart, the thing she'd been afraid to try in case she did it wrong. "We could do it tomorrow," Elena said. "If you want." Clara nodded once, kept cutting. "Clara," Elena said. The girl looked up. "Thank you," Elena said. "For not making it harder. When I first came, you could have." Clara held her gaze for a moment. "I was going to," she said. "I tried. You were too useful." A beat. "And then you were too—" She stopped. "Too what?" Clara looked away. "Too there," she said, which was imprecise and somehow exactly right. "You just kept being there, every day. And after a while it stopped feeling like having a stranger in the house and started feeling like—" She shrugged. The careful adolescent shrug that meant everything underneath was too large to present directly. "I know," Elena said. She did know. She'd felt it too, from her side of it. The way a stranger became a presence, and a presence became a fixture. And a fixture became, without any single moment you could point to, something that felt necessary. Something that felt like home. She had not had that in a long time. She had not known she was still capable of it. But here she was. That evening, she went out to the yard as the light was going golden in the way May evenings did, the particular generous light that made even a working ranch look like somewhere a person would choose. She stood at the fence along the south pasture where the grass was coming in and looked at the land. It was not spectacular country. It was not dramatic or beautiful in any grand sense. It was flat and spare, and the wind came off it in a way that never entirely let you forget you were small. But she'd spent a winter in it, and she knew its character now the way you knew the character of a difficult person you'd come to respect. Not through their ease, but through their difficulty. Through what it had cost both of you to reach an understanding. She heard the gate behind her. Gideon came to stand beside her at the fence. They stood there without talking for a while, looking at the pasture, at the evening light doing what it did. The first calves of spring were moving in the far corner, awkward and new. The barn was quiet. From the house behind them came the sound of Thomas and Nora arguing about something that escalated and then resolved, Clara's voice cutting through, firm and short. And then Samuel's laugh, the full, uncomplicated one. "What are you thinking?" Gideon said. She considered the honest answer. "That I spent most of my life getting the smallest portion of everything," she said, "and somehow ended up here." He was quiet for a moment. And it turns out the table was worth waiting for," she said. He looked at her sideways. She looked back at him. The almost smile arrived fully this time. The real one. The one she'd been working towards since October without knowing that's what she was doing. It changed his face entirely, briefly, the way light changed the land. She turned back to the pasture. He stayed beside her. The evening held them there for a while, the two of them, imperfect and tired and alive at the end of a hard thing, standing on ground they'd earned. She had arrived in Red Hollow with nothing but what she could carry and a willingness to do whatever needed doing for one meal a day and a roof. She had not expected this. She had not planned for this. She had just kept making the next decision and the next, kept doing what the day required, kept refusing to become less than what she was, even when becoming less would have been easier. And here was what she'd learned, standing at that fence in the May evening, in a way she could not have put into words in October, but could now. Survival was not about arriving at safety. It was not about waiting for someone to recognize your worth and hand you the life you deserved. It was about doing the next right thing every day without guarantee, and trusting that the accumulation of small right things would eventually add up to something real. It had. It wasn't perfect. The ranch still had debt. The south fence still needed work. Clara still carried things she would spend years learning to set down, and Thomas would probably be stubborn until he died. And Nora would ask questions that had no comfortable answers, and Samuel would keep knocking over his cup and probably would at 20. Gideon would still go quiet when he was worried, and she'd still run her numbers in the back of the recipe book, and neither of them would ever be finished being exactly as complicated as they were. None of that mattered. What mattered was the table, that it was theirs, that there was enough on it, that no one sitting around it had to calculate their right to be there. She had done that once, arrived at someone else's table and asked for the smallest portion, just enough to get through, just enough to survive. She had made herself as small and useful and unthreatening as she could manage, and had survived on it, and had built from it something she hadn't imagined. She would not forget what the smallest portion felt like. She didn't want to. That knowledge was part of her, and it had made her careful and practical and watchful in ways that had saved 4 people's lives this winter, and she'd take it with her into every season going forward. But she would not live there anymore. The table was hers. She was finally ready to take her seat at it.